Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the first in a series of dialogues we will be hosting with the photographers featured in our newly launched digital exhibition On Protest and Mourning. I'm Grace Aneiza Ali, the curator of this project, which quite sadly is not timely, but evergreen as we continue to wrestle with a history of state and police violence against Black lives. The last year in particular gathered and united us in unnecessary sorrow, but necessary tumult as we mobilized an unprecedented response against racism and violence. And yet almost a year later, as George Floyd's trial in Minneapolis retriggers and re-traumatizes, we find ourselves again contending with the sorrow, with the anger, with the exhaustion, and the grief of it all. For this exhibition on Protest and Mourning, we at CADI sought out photographers and filmmakers who have recorded and borne witness to our uprisings and to our insistence that the lives taken prematurely are mourned and are done so in public space. And through their images, capturing how we have grappled with our anger and our agony hand in hand, we see the ways in which protest is a form of mourning and mourning is a form of protest. Over the next few weeks, we will be in conversation with the photographers and the filmmakers who have generously lent their images and their voices to this exhibition. And they are Jon Henry, Vanessa Charlotte, Carlos Javier Ortiz, Terrence Jennings, Dee Dwyer, and Nadia Alexis. I also want to thank Kareem Johnson for creating a beautiful original composition for this project that pays tribute to the lives we've lost and loved. And you can listen to that original score as you look at the artist's images on the exhibition site on protestandmourning.digital. Tonight, we will spend time with Jon Henry as he shares with us his moving body of work, Stranger Fruit. Welcome, Jon. Jon is a Brooklyn-based visual artist working with photography and text. His work reflects on family, socio-political issues, grief, trauma, and healing within the African American community. And I also recently learned that Jon has some roots in my homeland, Guyana, so it's even more lovely to welcome you to the CADI family. Jon's body of work is quite expansive and award-winning, including the Arnold Newman Grant for New Directions in Photographic Portraiture, the Lens Culture's Emerging Artists Award, among many others. And I encourage our audience watching to visit our site for a more extensive bio on Jon's practice. As viewers to the digital exhibition site might have already seen, throughout On Protest and Mourning, we've paired each of the photographers' bodies of work with poems authored by notable Black poetic voices. And in her poem, The Joys of Motherhood, which we've paired with Jon's Stranger Fruit series, the poet Mwende Katwiwa writes, "There's something about being Black in America that has made motherhood sound like mourning." In curating this project, what I was truly drawn to in Stranger Fruit was Jon's decision to center the experience of Black mothers. In his portraits, we see laid bare the vulnerable emotional landscape of Black motherhood, what it means to mother, to labor, to keep safe, only to lose a son in this America. In conversation with Jon tonight is Qiana Mestrich, who recently expanded on Stranger Fruit for Photograph magazine. Welcome, Qiana. Thank you for being here. Qiana is a photography-focused interdisciplinary artist and a very thoughtful and brilliant writer and scholar based in New York. She's also founder of Dodge and Burn, Decolonizing Photography History, an arts initiative that aims to decolonize the medium by advocating for photographers of color. But first, before we hear from both Jon and Qiana, because we are beginning this dialogue series centering the experiences of Black mothers through Jon's work, Stranger Fruit, we asked our very special guest and a longtime friend to Caddy, Monifa Bandele, to share opening remarks. Welcome, Monifa. And Monifa has devoted both her personal and her professional life to advocating for economic security and justice for mothers, women, and families through the MomsRising organization. She's also part of the leadership teams for the Movement for Black Lives and for Communities United for Police Reform. Ms. Bandele, thank you so much for being here with us and for offering opening remarks as we launch our dialogue series. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Go right ahead.
Okay. Thank you so much for inviting me to this very, very powerful coming together of discussions around justice for mothers and the very, very important medium that is Black art. So in my opening remarks, I just wanted to touch on those two pieces, those two dynamics, and how they have really played off of one another for centuries. You know, I first want to give so much honor to our Black artists that are coming up in the dialogue, because Black art has really been foundational in fueling our Black liberation movements for centuries. When we study back in the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, it was literally Black art and Black artists that uplifted our freedom songs, that created dances for us, that created visual arts in quilts and other visual platforms to do several things. You know, one was to inspire us to keep going, to keep living, for the mothers to keep trying their best. The second piece was that it reflected back to us our humanity, because we were in a situation where our humanity was consistently and constantly being stripped from us. And it told our stories, told our truths, and dismantled the lies that were always being told about us. During that time, our political demands, our demands for abolition and freedom, were also articulated through our art. So art, you know, inspired, disrupted, fueled, and fed us for so long since we have been here in the Americas. And then when we move to the 1900s and we look at things like the Black arts movement and the critical role it played, not only in doing all of the inspiring, fueling, mirroring back to us, telling our stories, it was also a medium. You know, so like when we in the 16th and 17th and 1800s, we used our art to also communicate, right? We use our visual arts to literally create roadmaps to freedom. And we carry that tradition into the 1900s. And so when you look at things like the Black Panther news or Black news, or ways that visual artists incorporated their work into our political ideology and text to disseminate throughout our communities, to the songs that we sang during our protest movements, to the dances that we had. So we are not surprised that in this moment last year, in Freedom Summer 2020, that it was a convergence of not just activism and organizing, but that our art was at a high level, interplaying with us, pushing out our demands. We're coming out creatively and full of Black joy. All of our music, our dance, when you look at the millions of people who flooded what seemed like every street in America, there was always a very proud and bold display of Black art and Black joy. And so I'm always honored to be in a space that celebrates and looks at and dissects Black art and Black artists, because that is a part of our social justice movements. We cannot exist without it. We cannot communicate without it. We won't be as inspired and fired up as we are. And then for this very specific piece of powerful, powerful artistic and creative projects that is On Protest and Mourning, touching on what I've worked on for years, which is maternal justice, is just so timely. You know, it's like Grace said, it's untimely, and that it's kind of evergreen. But right now, we really are at the height of several movements that have been forging on for the past couple of years. So while we were also fighting in the streets for justice and to end mass criminalization, mass incarceration, and state violence against Black bodies, we also have been fighting a maternal health crisis amongst Black women and Indigenous women in the United States. And so up until 4 years ago, many people didn't know that the United States had one of the highest rates of maternal mortality in the developed world, and that the bulk of that laid solidly within our communities, meaning that Black women were dying at a higher rate just from giving birth to babies. And we are not surprised because of that history that was laid out that goes back to when we were brought here. And so maternal justice does something when we talk about it that brings all of this together. So we talk about maternal health, the demand for reproductive justice and having reproductive rights, but it also demands that we have rights throughout the existence, throughout the continuum of our motherhood. And primary to that is not only just making sure we have the right when, where, and how many children to have. It's not just making sure that when our children are born that we have basic human rights so that they can not only survive but thrive, but also making sure that we're able to maintain throughout our entire motherhood, meaning that our children should bury us. Our motherhood should be uninterrupted. And with what's happening with medical apartheid, not only are we dying prematurely in the hospitals and clinics, but our children are dying prematurely because of state violence and community violence. And so all of these things interrupt our motherhood. So I just want to thank the artists again today for bringing this discussion together, but also giving us so much inspiration, so much to chew on and dissect and think about and ideate on as we move forward to the next phase. I've been saying all year that there's going to be pre-2020 and post-2020. We're in the post-2020. We are looking forward, and not only are we leaning on our artists to inspire us and to fuel us, but to also help us unlock our collective imagination for what we are going to create together. We're dismantling the old. We're not going back to that after the pandemic. We're going to create a new reality. And our creative warriors are critical in helping us to design that. So thank you again. Thank you for having me, Kati. And thank you so much, Qiana and Jon. I cannot wait to hear your discussion.
Ms. Bandele, thank you so much for reiterating why we're doing this dialogue series with these image makers, because we've always been able to turn to artists to help us navigate these very difficult and challenging questions. And also thank you for those very powerful words that our motherhood should not be interrupted. And we at Kati appreciate all of your advocacy and activism for mothers, for Black mothers and Black families that you've done throughout the years. Thank you so much for that. Thank you.
Thank you.
And so now we will hear from Jon. Jon will share a little bit more. What we've shown on Protest and Mourning is just a snippet of the series. And Jon is going to take us through a larger view of Stranger Fruit. And after, Qiana will join him in conversation. For our audience watching, please do share your thoughts and comments. If you're on YouTube, share them in the chat. If you're on Facebook, share them in the comments. We'll be seeing them and looking at them, and we will come back and engage those questions and comments with Jon and Qiana in about 40 minutes or so in the Q&A portion of our conversation. And so, Jon, welcome. The screen is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Grace, and thank you for those words, Monifa. They were really beautiful. So I would like to get into Stranger Fruit and, how it is began. Basically, it's like a brief snippet of how the project has come together and the three elements that really comprise the project. The project, Stranger Fruit, began as a response to the murders of African American men due to police violence. Now, while the work began in 2014, the concept really began in 2007, 2008. 2008, I just returned from Vienna, and I remember the next day I was going back to work, and that day was the verdict of the Sean Bell trial. And Sean Bell was the young man who was murdered at his bachelor party in Jamaica, Queens. I'm born and raised from Queens, New York, so seeing those images again in the paper really, it was like reliving this trauma for me all over again. I'm born and raised in Queens. I know Jamaica. That story, really hit home. Again, there's just the familiarity of events. Sean, I think, was a year younger than me at the time. A year later, one of my good friends was getting married, and at his bachelor party in the middle of New Jersey, we're all together, to celebrate our homie getting married. All I could think of was Sean Bell. All I could think of was, what if this was happening to him? What if this was happening to us? Why do these tragedies continue to happen? I was too young to understand Rodney King. I knew something had happened I remember seeing the footage, and I knew something important had happened, but I didn't understand the complexity of what was going on, and I was just too young. But when the Sean Bell murder happened, I completely understood, and everything really, hit home for me. So, do we have images to share? What's going on here? Thank you. So, fast forward to 2014, where the project began, there's a long time where I was just sitting, with this idea that I wanted to say something, but I just didn't have the visual language to speak on it, to say what I wanted to say. So the project begins 2014, and it's been ongoing as I've been photographing it up until most recently this past weekend. There are a few things that are really important to the project. One, the first thing that really stands out is the idea of the pieta, using this motif to tell the story. So, all the images is broken down in three parts. The first part is this mother-son connection, where using the motif of the pieta, Mary, the Mother of God, holding the dead body of Christ, as after his descent from the cross. So using this, thinking about the suffering, thinking about, what these mothers must go through, and thinking about, how this, great deal of trauma we're experiencing over and over again, and how close to home it can hit, was really important for me, and really something that I wanted to touch on. Something else that was important in thinking about the pieta was thinking about the gaze, thinking of the mothers looking directly into the viewer, and how that affects the viewer, how that affects the story and the narrative. There's something so strong in, seeing the gaze of the mother that it makes it difficult to look away. And that was something that I wanted to use as a visual strategy to hold the viewer's attention just for a little longer. Makes it, having that gaze there makes it difficult for the viewer to simply encounter the work and then leave, or, see the work in space or online or wherever, and then pass by as if nothing's happened. So it calls their attention and brings them in a little deeper. And I think that was something that was, really transformative in the work. Something else, I was thinking about with the work is that these images are performance as well. Oftentimes we think of performance as video or as dance or acting, but these images are performance. The mothers in these images have not lost their sons, but they understand the reality that this could happen to them, that this could happen to someone in their community, that this could happen to their family, as these tragedies have happened in the most randomest of occasions. So, these are, real people and real feelings and real, issues that they're having to go through and deal with and think about. So this is why it was important for me to also, start the project, but to continue it, to photograph in multiple locations, to travel across the country, photographing it. So while I started making the images in New York, the series is not just, this isn't just a New York issue. This is a nationwide issue, if not global issue. So it's important to go from New York to Alabama to Chicago to Los Angeles, and where I was just this past week, I was just in Utah, to show this with different backdrops, as this truly does affect all of us in this community. Furthering on that, the environment is really important. So I'm looking at, urban cities. I'm looking at more rural locations. Because again, it's not just a New York City thing or a big city issue. Oftentimes these tragedies are happening in the most bizarre of locations, inside the home, in a park, on the side of a road, in the middle of the street, as we've seen, just last year with, Breonna Taylor and George Floyd. So the environment is really crucial to the images, and that's why I've been traveling for the past 7 years now, making these images. Now, if we can move forward with the images, like I said, the recreation of the Pieta is one part of the project. But another part of the project are these portraits of the mothers in isolation. These portraits of the mothers where they're not looking into the camera. And this really came about because I was looking at the work of Frances Kearney and her series, Five People Thinking the Same Thing. And these images really stood out to me, thinking of portraits of the mothers, but now we're thinking of the space, thinking of where they are, and we start as viewers putting ourselves in their minds. What are they thinking about? What could be going through their minds? And obviously, as for a picture, it's just, okay, what are they thinking? But using this also as connection to mothers who have lost, what is normal supposed to look like after the event? Every time these events happen, the same, order of things happen, where there's, media outcry, there are protests, excessive media coverage. You view the crime over and over again, or if there's footage, you see it over and over again on social media. And there's a trial, and the trial ends, justice is never given. But even if there is an indictment, that's still not justice. These people, these men, these women should still be alive. Their lives should not be cut short by those who are supposed to protect and serve. So, thinking of those mothers who have lost, what is a month later, a year later, 5 years later, what are we supposed to comfort them with? What does normal look like afterwards? So in these images, you can sometimes sense that there is a second presence that's there, but that presence is missing. Sometimes not so much. Sometimes it's just them in the space, focusing on absence, hope, loss, remembrance, and grief. And like I said, this was something that I thought was really interesting to include with their son images. Now, the third part of the project is a text component. And these are from the mothers who are in the series. After I, I get back to New York and I have the film developed and I send out the images to the families. I send them the images and I send the mothers a questionnaire. It's like a 5 or 6 question questionnaire. And it's, based on what their thoughts were on the project leading into it, after it, about what's going on in the country, how they approach this subject with their sons or their family, and just even, questions like describing the motion of holding your son in that vulnerable position. And the words obviously are incredible. The images are my words, the artist statement are my words, but having the words of the mothers in the series as well really helps to shape everything and really give voice to those who, I guess, whose voices haven't been heard in this situation. As these mothers are, having to deal with this, having these real fears, these real concerns over and over again, and it's almost as if they've fallen on deaf ears as the country almost ignores that this is even an issue. I just shared 3 text pieces. I'll read them really quickly. It only increases my concern over the current state of affairs in this country regarding race and gender. No one is exempt from being victimized by perceived thoughts and ideas of others simply based on differences in color. Next one. I feel hurt, anguish, and emotional turmoil. I recognize that this was only a moment in time, but that's actually a depiction of life. Every second is a moment in time. That one moment can define the rest of your life. When I wake up and before I sleep at night, my son is the one person that's always on my mind. I want to know that he's safe. Next, please. As I think the top portion is cut. Q. As I was gradually pulled into the scene and told about the pose, it began to make me think of the daily thoughts I have about my son. I have thoughts of love, change, determination, growth, and encouragement. I also have concerns regarding his health and safety as it relates to the growing conditions across this nation with African American males. There needs to be an immediate attention to stop the killing of Black males and suffering of mothers. This is something that's very real, and this is something that is affecting, millions of Americans across the country. Mothers, families are having to have these conversations and worry that, people who are, paid to protect and serve the community are murdering, sons, daughters. We're losing lives because of this. And that's kind of crazy that we're still having these conversations, especially with having that footage, having that visual evidence. That's why, Rodney King was so important. Seeing that video evidence and seeing in the courtroom, and then fast forwarding today where you're seeing it all the time through dash cams, cell phones, etc., and we're still having the same result. And as a country, it's like almost like we haven't moved forward, that this is something that is very important and should not exist. I could go on a rant about policing. We can talk about that maybe a little later, but police can just, they know how to de-escalate a situation when the assailant has a gun. But it seems when it comes to Black people, death is always at hand. And that's really where, Stranger Fruit takes off and what it's speaking about. And those are the 3 elements that make up the project.
Kat, we can bring Qiana in to be in conversation with Jon now.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Kadi, and thank you, Grace, for inviting me to be in conversation with Jon Henry and his incredible work. Thank you, Monifa, for your beautiful words as well. You really said a lot of very poignant points, and this idea of maternal justice is a really big key word here, I think. First, before we begin, I'd like to do a quick land acknowledgement. I'd like to acknowledge that we are meeting on the indigenous lands of Turtle Island, the ancestral name for what is now called North America. Moreover, I would like to acknowledge the Esopus peoples of the Lenape communities who have been part of the lands that I'm particularly sitting on right now, which is based in upstate New York and Saugerties. So thank you, Jon, and I think we'll get started. Lots of questions for you. You've touched a lot on some of the points that we'll talk about already in your presentation, but I wanted to kind of start early on, especially since I'm also a fellow New Yorker, born and raised. I immediately, when thinking about this conversation, was really kind of thinking about some of my early experiences with police violence, not personal experiences, but again, sort of witnessing these experiences growing up as a child in New York City. And New York City, this also what you said was really true in terms of this violence doesn't necessarily occur in urban areas, but I would like to kind of focus on New York right now, just as I present this question in terms of your experience. But New York City does have a long and vicious history of police aggression against Black people. Particularly, there are two cases that I remember growing up, one of Abner Louima and Amadou Diallo, two victims of the NYPD that I remember hearing about while growing up on television a lot. You mentioned the murder of Sean Bell in 2006 as being the case that sparked your idea for the series. I'd love to sort of hear more about your emotional experience growing up as a Black man in a Black male in the city, and how that may have also influenced this work.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember the story of Abner Louima and Amadou Diallo very vividly. At the time, Amadou Diallo really stayed with me because I was just, I think I was just graduating high school, and I was, still didn't know anything, of course, but I was like, just the idea that, I was 41 bullets or something, or almost 50 bullets shot for this one man. And it just made no sense. I was like, how does this happen? Like, how does this, like, how do we get to this point? But then not knowing, what it preceded, as far as, Rodney King, but more so, all these stories of policing and harassment that wasn't caught on tape, that wasn't highly publicized. It really stayed with me. But like I said, the event, Sean Bell, was when it was really the tipping point, when everything really, hit home for me, feeling that, just the visuals, the seeing, one of his friends face down on the pavement and bloodied. And that really just like, one of the images that like, really sent me over the edge. But yeah, always it's been this, this constant distrust of the police where, you have to have this, almost this buffer when you're dealing with law enforcement, where you need to, and it goes back to my mother always saying, be careful, be careful. And of course, I'm like, Mom, I get you, I hear you, but my goodness. But then you don't understand, like what you're up against when you go outside, as there are all these different factors, potentially against you. But yeah, it's just been intense, thinking of, interactions with law enforcement and thinking, just like, okay, if you're with a group or something, and let's say you have one who's a hothead in the group, if that's something that's going to trigger something in that officer where things can go really south really quickly, or but in coming back to this idea of like the talk or whatever, and just like oh my God, how are we going to get out of this situation? So yeah, it's just bizarre. And everyone talks about the police story or the cop story, and it's real. I mean, I think one of my first like iterations with having that cop story was just super random. I mean, we're out in Long Island. I'm coming back. One of my good friends drove me out to visit my grandmother's grave in Calverton National Cemetery out in Long Island. We're coming back and we get pulled over. Just another situation of driving while Black.
Right.
First question he asks is this our car? Like, it's just, and of course, in that moment, I'm not even like thinking. My mind is already, on other things. But it's just like, how many times do these instances happen, and then it gets escalated into something terrible? So.
Absolutely. I think for me, hearing about Abner Louima was the first time where I sort of felt, okay, the police are not here to protect us. Like they are also can be a predatory force. And those, and it was really interesting how back then it was really the narrative is really around, not that these are Black men, these are immigrants, and that it was almost kind of excused because it was, these are immigrants and they're here and they're invading, and it was sort of, this violence was sort of justified, and so yeah, a lot of younger generation that I speak to now kind of only know Black Lives Matter. They only know sort of the issues that have been brought up because of the BLM movement, but I feel like we really kind of need to acknowledge a lot of the victims of the past as well.
Absolutely.
So let's definitely get a little bit more into your work and the influence of your work, the sort of real visual and creative influence of your work. Particularly, your series pays a kind of creative homage to two major art historical references and cultural references. One you've already spoken about in terms of the religious concept of the Pietà, which was a popular subject amongst Northern European Renaissance artists. But then your title of your series, references the iconic sort of anti-lynching protest song "Strange Fruit," made popular by Billie Holiday. Can we get a little bit deeper into this idea of pity and devotion that the Pietà intended its viewers to feel? Specifically thinking of the Pietà that I know through my art historical studies, which is Michelangelo's sculpture of the Pietà, which, Kat, maybe you can bring it up on the screen. I would love to sort of talk about how you've leveraged the sort of the power of this religious social experience for your own work. And then kind of particularly going to your images, I noticed that your work has a lot of your images have a lot of variations of this classic Pietà pose, whereas sometimes in your images, the male or the Jesus figure is not held within the mother's embrace. And I think it's also worth noting, now that we have the image up on the screen, it's particularly in Michelangelo's sculpture, Mary doesn't directly touch the body of Jesus with her hands. She holds the body in her right hand with a cloth that's meant to signify, quote, the sacredness of his suffering and the divinity of his form. In your images, Jon, the mothers specifically touch their sons' bodies and touch their flesh, which I think is a really poignant and powerful gesture.
Yeah. So I guess where are we going to start with that one? I guess thinking of.
I know there's a lot thrown at you at once, but
it's all good. Yeah, there's a lot in there. Thinking of, I guess, pity and devotion, and kind of tied. Okay, I'll get there. But thinking of just this idea of suffering. So after Sean Bell, I came back to not just thinking of. Sorry, I'm talking about after the bachelor party of my friend, where of course I'm thinking of Sean Bell. But I'm thinking, then my mind starts to wander where I'm thinking of his, wife to be that he would never get to marry, his child who he would never get to see grow old, and then beyond that, thoughts of the family, thoughts of the mothers, thoughts of what it must be like for a mother to lose their child, and just thinking of that intense pain, that suffering, and that grief, and like how no one should have to go through this, especially in this circumstance. That law enforcement be the ones to take the life of a child for absolutely nothing. No crime was committed. Even if a crime was committed, that still doesn't mean that police can justify murder, manslaughter, whatever. So I guess that's what I was kind of thinking of as the work progressed. And like I said, I knew, since I used to work in a church, and I used to study painting independently. While I was supposed to be in college, I was going to hang out at the Met anytime I felt depressed. And I just ended up sitting upstairs, staring at painting over and over again. So the Pietà was kind of a natural landing point for me. As I knew that Michelangelo, but I also knew other versions of the Pietà, like the Titian, Bouguereau and, you know, all these other like classical paintings. It's interesting about, you know, Mary holding with the cloth in the Michelangelo piece, but there's so many versions of the Pietà where, you know, there are all these different configurations where Mary is either physically holding Jesus, or he's leaned up against her body or leaned up against something, where I would use that in the series also as a mode of problem solving. It's great that we have the Michelangelo piece up here right now, because what most people don't realize is, you know, Mary's scale in relation to a 33-year-old man is enormous. And this is something that I would have to contend with when I'm making images, you know, because the mothers and sons, I would never know like their scale. I would never know how to, you know, if there are multiple sons, how do I make the image if they're sons and daughters, or, you know, just adjacent family members. So thinking of how to make constructions, how to make different compositions, oftentimes touching. Sometimes there's not that physical touch, but most often there is in my images. But these are the things that I'm thinking about as I'm, you know, making the images, and just like one way to, you know, connect the themes. So like the themes are, you know, so I'm using that mother-son connection, but using different ways to continue to tell the story, even if it's not the exact representation of the Pietà in each one, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And yeah, it's a couple of those images where there isn't any touch present are particularly heart-wrenching for me, because the experience of mothering is so much about physical touch. And we know so much about how, you know, we should hold and caress our children, you know, starting from birth, to convey love and to convey affection and to convey how special they are and how beautiful they are. So thank you for that. And of course, you know, that particular sculpture as well has a very triangular shape that has been talked about lots. And so it's interesting to think about your construction as well, the construction, how you've may have placed the bodies within your image, to also think about scale in that sense of mother and child. Maybe we can move on to the other image that for me really resonated. I'm sorry, not this one, Kat, but the last image, the Renee Cox image. When I first saw your series, this image immediately came to mind as someone who's been studying photography for a long time. And this is Renee Cox's Yo Mama's Pietà, which I actually saw back in like 2000, 2001 when her work was up at the Brooklyn Museum, and it was sort of caused this huge uproar, particularly with Mayor Giuliani at the time. And of course, I know you reference this image a lot as an influence. Do you remember how Cox's image sort of made you feel when you first saw it, and particularly as someone who was raised in the Christian faith? How did you receive the sort of radical pro-Black upending of the Pietà?
Yeah, I vaguely remember when I encountered this work. I encountered this work through Renee's other pieces. And then I landed on this, on the Yo Mama's Pietà from the series, and really it was crazy. Was it didn't have like a positive or negative effect on me as far as religiously, but really artistically is where it stood out for me. Because, you know, prior to this work, I'd been working with athletes a lot. I've been working with sports photographing athletes, and I still photograph athletes. So this was a large departure from that mode of thinking. But really, it was just it was like this breakthrough, thinking of the Black body in art by a Black artist, the importance of agency, the importance of telling, you know, being the author of those stories, you know, not letting someone else dictate it. And, you know, Renee being the mother figure in the image, you know, really helped solidify all that. Then I was like, oh wow, yeah, that makes absolute sense. You know, the Black body by a Black artist, you know, telling the narrative, and just how powerful that would be. And it's not, you know, transcribed by someone else. It's not being told through someone else. Like, I can take agency over that. So that was really strong for me, and that's really where why this and Dr. David Driscoll's painting "Behold Thy Son" were really like the two most important contemporary pieces of art that helped forward the project.
Great. Yeah, for me, Renee was also one of those artists where I felt this idea of performance that you talk about really kind of came to light. Like, wow, and not just performance, but also being a director, like having a Black woman direct an image, direct a scene, direct the creation of a piece of artwork in this way was such a powerful act for me. And of course, Renee being a mother herself, um, not only do you have a Black woman, but you have a Black mother doing this.
Yeah.
And for me, that was just a super powerful act when I came to know the work, Renee's work in general. And so kind of continuing with this idea of performance that we talked about before, I see the mothers in your series wielding a lot of what I would call like soft power, in the sense that they're choosing to participate in this project. And so I see and I feel their selflessness, and that they're using their own bodies to speak upon the sort of immeasurable anxiety, grief, fear, and mourning that Black mothers in this country must contend with every day. I'd love to talk about, I know you talked a little bit about the mother's gaze in the individual portraits, but I'd also kind of like to talk about sort of this idea of the interior mental space that we see in some of those portraits, their interior sort of mental and spiritual space. Until this year, I'd never really seen those portraits. Whenever I saw your series, my apologies for the phone. Whenever I saw your series, I'd only seen the Pietà images within like photography outlets and other publications. Do you know sort of why that is, or and also another question is, did you sort of always intend to show just the Pietà, or was the idea sort of to have this three-pronged approach to the work always there?
I would say maybe a year or two into the project, I realized that it was going to be in three parts. The text component was the last part that was added in, and that was in, I guess, 2016 was when I really knew that the text was going to be a part of it. But I guess early on, I think I knew that I wanted those images of the mothers, those portraits as well. I thought that visually it would be too redundant if it was just mother son, that Pietà image over and over and over again, or just from a artistic standpoint that maybe that the viewer would get lazy or lose interest, or not lose interest, but they could anticipate the next step, and then I would lose them somewhere along the line. So I've always tried. That's why I've tried to make that image as best as possible. Why outlets don't use the other images, I'm not sure. I think, well, that's a question for them too. But
absolutely,
it's yeah, and they are important. Those images are very important to the series, because obviously it gives you that break visually, and you really start to, I guess, brings you in deeper. But I guess people maybe thinking accessibility, thinking that the Pietà, the mother son images are so strong or so poignant that they just want to focus on this. So, and the images kind of work as a tableau as well, where the single image can almost tell the entire story. So maybe that's why they focus on that. But yeah, the series is in three parts, and I think, I'm not sure. That they would have to answer that as far as why they don't. Select,
I definitely. Definitely the onus will be put on them, and I hope that in further displays of the work that it is included fully as a fully realized project, the way that you've intended. And I think it is important to include the portraits. There's an intimacy there that we get. We get to kind of know I feel like we get to know the mothers a little bit more based on their surroundings, their environment, how you position them. And again, there's a little bit of that the mental space and what you've talked about earlier in terms of what happens after these violent acts have been committed, what's left, what is the sort of, what is that space that these mothers are living in on a day-to-day basis, which I feel like doesn't really get recognized as much as it should. There's always so much attention on the violent act itself, and on the death itself, as you mentioned earlier. So also regarding performance, similar to the Virgin Mother Mary's stoic disposition in the Pietà, despite holding her son's dead body, in your images, there's no sort of overt drama, no outcry or passionate emotional displays of mourning. How should we interpret this?
Yeah, that's all, by choice, that I wanted the images to be deadpan. I wanted them to be neutral, just to let because I felt that it was stronger there, that, if there were tears or if there was, sadness, that might come across as maybe toy or acting or maybe too much. But I thought that there was a real power and a real dignity in the mother just, having this appeal with the viewer, just staring straight into the viewer, like, this is what's going on. Is my child going to be next? What are you going to do to prevent this from happening? So I guess using it as an appeal and just, using it as a visual strategy to, connect with the viewers. Oftentimes when I'm talking with students, I'm thinking of like, okay, what is something that you can use as a strategy to hold someone's attention? Because, on Instagram, you look at something for about 2 seconds and that's it. Right. If you get to 2 seconds, okay, well, what's something that you can use to make them come back to the image, for a minute, hold them there for 3 minutes, have them come back to the work a week later, a month later. So yeah, something about, just having the mothers looking directly into camera, directly into the viewer, and no expression. So you have to make your own decisions. You are reading it your own way, not your own way, but you're making your own read of, what's going on, and, the pose and just the emotions that's happening. So that's kind of where all of that came from.
That one particular image with the target sign is doubly powerful in that sense that, we get the power of her stare at us, but then we also get this icon of a target. And so it really kind of brings home the message in multiple ways.
And I'd been trying to use that symbol for at least a year. I think this was in Inglewood, and I was in earlier 2019. I was in Minneapolis, Minnesota, the home of Target, because that's something that just stood out to me because of that circle, because of it representing a halo. Thinking of religion, but also just the word Target and the bullseye symbol, just how layered that was. So that was something that I definitely wanted to use in the images. I just I was trying to find a way to use it, couldn't find it in Minneapolis or in Minnesota because it just didn't work out. But something that I'm always thinking about is how to make the images that I want to make, and different symbols that I can add in there.
Yeah, and you mentioned, and now that I'm looking at the image, I'm thinking of the fact that they're in a parking lot, and and now we're in a home. I'd love to kind of move on a little bit to your use of space and site and landscape, because I know it is very intentional. And of course, the environment I feel like is very crucial to this work, and landscape itself is so often traumatically intertwined with the history of violence against Black bodies in this country, as expressed by Billie Holiday in the song "Strange Fruit." And some of the images for me reference places where unforgettable tragedies have occurred. For example, the image Untitled Number 22 in Berwyn, Illinois, where a mother looks out over the railing of an apartment complex, which for me conjured up memories of the balcony railing of the Lorraine Hotel in Memphis, where MLK was assassinated in 1968. And then you have another image that shows a mother and her son sitting outside of the perimeter wall of what I interpret to be Manhattan Central Park, which then makes me think of the case of the Central Park Five, a group of 5 young Black and Latinx boys who were wrongfully convicted, and imprisoned for raping and assaulting a white woman. Can you speak more a little bit about your choice of place and site, and sort of the haunting role that they play in your photographs?
Yeah, I'm thinking of, and it's always hard to describe, like people always ask what I'm looking for in a location when I travel. And it's all kind of up here. If we can stay with this image, for example, like I'm thinking of, I wanted to go to Omaha. I was like, I have to go to Omaha to make an image. And the only thing I know, if Omaha is one, Black folks live in Omaha or Lincoln. And the only other thing I know about, Nebraska is corn. But I'm thinking of like the expanse of just like fields and that expanse of America, like once you get on the other side of the Mississippi where it's just space and land, and then using that as just like this continual landscape, this like horizon line of just like nothingness behind it. So again, I'm thinking there are a lot of things I'm thinking of when I go to each location. If we can go to one of the images before this, that would be great, Kat. We can stay right here. So
is that Little Rock?
And that is Little Rock High. And of course, this is probably one of the most obvious locations as far as like intentional use of a backdrop, where it's Little Rock Central, which is talking about the Little Rock Nine, and segregation in the school system. But usually I'm looking at something that's indicative of the location without beating the viewer over the head. Like I said, this is a rare occurrence where, I'm using something where you can see clearly this is, Little Rock Central High School. But usually I'm using something that, what can say that this is from Los Angeles, from New Orleans, from Miami. What are, cultural indicators? Maybe it's thinking of the architecture, thinking of the way that the neighborhood is made up. And all of these images are environmental as far as, how they go to the families. This is all where they live, where they work. In this image, the mother went to Little Rock Central. So, they're all of these locations where I'm making the images, the families have a personal connection to.
Interesting. And speaking of kind of the families that you're working with, I'm wondering, and I know the time it takes to sort of set up, I know you're working with large format, and the time it takes to sort of set up the images. And I'm assuming you're spending quite a bit of time with these families as well. And I'd love to kind of return a little bit back to the talk, something that you mentioned in your presentation. When meeting and working with your subjects, this concept of the talk that Black mothers and parents have to give their children about how to deal with law enforcement come up at all? I know that you do have texts in the work as well, but I'd love to know if that's something that came up.
Yeah, sometimes if we have the time, we'll talk about it. It is one of the questions that's in the 6-question questionnaire that I send them, where I ask them, how do you approach this topic with your children? And it varies because, sometimes they're young children and they haven't had that conversation yet. Some of them, they're just, like easing them into like, listen, this is something that you need to think about. This is something that you need to be concerned with as you're, just keep it in the back of your mind as they're, going from like 9 and then leading up to their teens. And then, obviously when the children are older, mothers are, you really get to have that conversation where, they've had that conversation. And I guess the annoying, scary, frustrating part is that it's all under this umbrella where, it really sadly doesn't even matter.
Doesn't matter, yeah.
Where you can have these conversations and you can say, this is what you should think about. This is what you need to think about, follow the directions. Okay, well, that doesn't always work. we're still having these conversations where it's like, and I think there was a story, I think it was this year, where a police officer murdered a young man, where he gave him conflicting instructions. Where it was something, I don't remember the story, and don't quote me, and I have to look it up. It was something about, hand placement, putting his hands up, but at the same time putting his hands somewhere else and doing something else where he couldn't do it while his hands were up. And it was just like, and then it ended up leading to their death. It's like, so yeah, we have the conversation on the talk. Sometimes we get to talk about it while we're making the images. But it's loaded and it's heavy. We're still having these conversations, and it's heart-wrenching.
It is. It's really sad and disappointing that, a particular group of people have to even think about having these conversations with their children and have to kind of stifle the freedom that children naturally have in the world because of something that we feel like will inevitably happen. I remember reading an NPR article last year about a mother who just felt like she was exhausted with having the conversation, because as you said, there's almost no way to protect your children. There's almost nothing you can say that in that moment will possibly save them from a bullet, or save them for any other tragic occurrence. And I wanted to move on to kind of talking about, in this age of increasingly mass spectacularized violence against Black people, and the referencing of, there's a particular text in your work that states, I think I found this from your website, I quote, "I feel like Tyler could be the next hashtag." Can we talk about a little bit how your very much analog work has functioned across social media, and especially in an age where young people live so much on social media? I'm really interested in how your work has sort of traveled across these digital spaces. And I feel like I also kind of need to acknowledge the role of technology in both calling out and witnessing anti-Blackness in law enforcement, but at the same time, we're sort of constantly reliving the trauma of these deaths through social media. How has that impacted your work, really? What would you say?
I'm not really sure. I mean, I know the social media is how the work has been shared and how it's exploded again on such a large scale. So, definitely thanks for that, because I'm not sure how else the work would have gotten such notoriety.
Right.
But yeah, I do always come back to this idea of trauma and thinking of just the technology's role in it, as far as the footage that we're seeing over and over and over again, and what that does to not just myself but the community. And on two fronts, I think. One, sadly we've needed the footage, we've needed the visual evidence for people to understand what is going on.
What's going on?
I don't know if people would have cared about George Floyd unless they saw the video of 9 minutes, this dude being on his neck and him dying there. So in that regard, it's, you need that, sadly, you need that footage. But yeah, on the other hand, you're just like, as the community, we're just like, oh my God, when we've been talking about this forever, why does it take you to have to then see it to believe us? And then again, just seeing it repeatedly over and over and over again, it just, one, you don't want to be desensitized to it, because these are individual lives, and it's, incredibly painful to witness. Like one of these other pieces that I also come back to often, this other video, is the Laquan Mcdonald dash cam footage. Laquan Mcdonald was the young man who was shot and killed in Chicago, where, of course, the officer said he lunged with a knife. He did not. And then, 16 bullets, killing him there on the spot. And yeah, I mean, I think that video was released 2014, like just as I was, getting ready to start the project. So again, here we are thinking about Sean Bell all over again, thinking of Rodney King, thinking of all these instances that haven't been caught on film, or maybe instances that haven't led to a death, but just these inequalities with policing and the African American community with Black and brown people. It's just, it's just intense that we're having these moments over and over again, and so highly visible.
And it's unfortunate because I feel like we've been down this road before. There is an archive of lynching photography, right? That was very popular, and so there's definitely been evidence of anti-Black violence in this country, long archived, long held evidence. Of course, those photographs had a very different intention when they were made. So, they weren't sort of made as proof, as witness to these acts. But to the point of photography, especially photography kind of being the first form of social media, in my opinion, and the first sort of visual media or mass visual media to communicate to large groups. I feel like it's really unfortunate that we're in this position. And again, when we have to relive this trauma, I have specifically tried to stay away from, for personal mental reasons, stay away from looking at a lot of this footage. And I find myself, even if I look at a news program, I find that I end up watching it anyway, because they will just inadvertently show it as part of the reel, as part of their video. And so it's almost like you can't avoid it. You can't avoid being traumatized by this, and you can't. And there is almost there's no dignity there. There's no respect for the fact that this is a life being taken, and that we're witnessing this.
I mean, even before, even if it's not a life being taken. I mean, just remember, like, before the footage of George Floyd came out, and before we heard about Breonna Taylor about this time last year or March or whatever, specifically here in New York City. I mean, as we're going through a global pandemic, what are we seeing? We're seeing footage of police officers handing out masks to white folks in mass on the West Side, on wherever in these parks, and then in Harlem, in the Bronx, they're beating the shit out of Black and brown people. Over the same thing. And you're just like, even in a global pandemic, we can't escape this, ridiculous treatment. So yeah, it just boggles the mind that we, have to continue to have these conversations.
And it speaks to the deep roots of racism in this country, for sure. That requires sort of systemic change and institutional change. You mentioned Breonna Taylor, and I wanted to ask this question. Sandra Bland also being a woman whose death has sort of sparked protests, and she's been at the forefront as well of sort of this national discussion around police brutality. What is your series focus only on mothers and their sons? Is that
it's intentional. The project focuses on mother-son. So I'm just looking at the mother-son relationship because I know what that relationship is, that relationship with my mother. So that's something that I wanted to kind of narrow in on and focus on. I thought that the project might get too, not loose, but not to track, but if I expanded it to mothers and daughters, or people also ask if like fathers are involved. I felt if it was concise and if it was just thinking of the mother son visually in the images, that it might be stronger, or at least keep the viewer's mind in that one frame of thought. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, Black women matter. Black trans lives matter. We have to make space for, we have to think about Tony McDade as well in this. I mean, we're losing trans lives for the same reasons. Everyone's under this umbrella and no one's safe from, this ridiculous act of policing. So yeah, I'm always thinking of mothers and daughters and, just children. But yeah, I focused it on mothers and sons just to, keep the viewer rooted in, I don't know. It's difficult. It's thinking of, as an artist, like, is this going to be distracting? Are they going to lose focus in the project or in the work or in the message? Which is the same reason why all the mothers in the series are Black. Because a white mother with a Black child, I don't think it would fit the series. That would be a different series or a different conversation. So that's why I wanted to keep it, just one-on-one the entire way through.
I completely understand it as from an artist's perspective that, when you do a body of work, there has to be certain parameters that you kind of stick to, both from a practical perspective as well as a kind of content and a theoretical perspective. So, but thank you for answering that question for sure. And I was also kind of a similar question, a sort of parallel question. As we all know, it takes a village to raise children. And so I was wondering, did you ever consider including grandmothers as your subjects, or others who take on the role of mothering but may not necessarily have given birth to their sons?
Yeah, in Untitled number 7 in Mount Vernon, there's a grandmother in that image. The mother and grandmother are holding hands, and there's another one of those images where they're not touching the son. The son is slightly in the foreground. And yeah, it really would just be it's difficult enough to find the families that are willing to be a part of the series, because it's so emotional and because it hits too close to home for many people. So if there was that opportunity, then absolutely. But one of the other like logistical things that we're dealing with in the series is, especially when they're sons that are older, is, do they live in the same state as their mother? Do they live in the same city? Does grandma live there as well? For that particular image that I actually don't have up to show, the mother, none of them live together, but the mother and the son lived in New Jersey, and they wanted to include grandmother in the photo. So that's why we all went up to Mount Vernon, because grandma lives a block away from that little corner, which is where I made both images, which is City Hall with the 3 flags behind them, and the police station is right next to it, just adjacent on the right. Grandma lives 1 block behind the police station. So that's kind of how that all came together. But yeah, if it's really all about, putting the, organizing people to get them into the images, which is a challenge in and of itself.
Sure. I think that just that generational perspective is interesting for sure. And thank you for pointing out that one image. I think I may have missed that in the series. I think we're probably going to wrap up soon our conversation and do some Q&A shortly. But I did want to sort of ask you to talk a little bit about some of the feedback you may have received, whether positive or negative, about this work from the general public.
Yeah, the feedback has been overwhelmingly positive, and that's been great. I don't get enough hate mail. That does bother me a little bit, but
Really?
what are you gonna do?
Yeah,
because
that's interesting. A friend of mine, Nona Faustine, whose work you probably know, she told me quite a bit about some of the negative comments that she's received about her work. And it's a personal work in a different way, in which that she's using her body to stand in for the Black female, particularly the Black female has been held in slavery. So she's definitely got quite a bit of negative attention, but it's interesting that you haven't.
I mean, so I only got like, maybe 1 or 2 hate mails, like people like actually emailed me, which is cool. It was great. I reply to them, tell them, whatever. I tell them that they're, not that they're dumb, but I tell them I answer specifically to them and tell them why their opinion is just like, what are you talking about? Yeah. But I guess like it's more of the hate mail comes through maybe through social media, through like when it's posted on like the New Yorker, or it's posted on, you know, these, you know, like National Geographic or whatever. And I don't have the time to go through those comments. I don't even look at them. It's like kind of like reliving the trauma. And then like, I'm not here to have, you know, discourse with people on Facebook and Instagram. Like, right. No. You want to write me a letter? Cool. I can tell you exactly about the project and we can talk about it. But right. I'm not going through the comments of nobody who's just like trolling to be a troll, or you know, wants to just give these, you know, ridiculous, you know, the typical answers that make absolutely no sense. Oh, but black people kill black people. Okay, well, does that mean that law enforcement should just kill black people? Like that's fine. It's just like, you know, and all these other like stupid things where I don't even, you know, after a while I don't even yeah.
It's not worth your mental space or emotional space to answer.
No, not even.
It's really a performance for them as well. So it should be a performance.
Exactly.
And there's Grace. Oh, we can't hear you.
Let me unmute myself. Qiana, thank you so much for just these really thoughtful questions that give Jon an opportunity to expand on this series. And I want to actually continue, not the hate mail conversation, but just in a similar vein. And this is a question for both of you. You know, this project for us at CADI, for myself in a curatorial role, was full of a lot of anxiety. I mean, I lost a lot of if I'm honest, you know, sleep over this project, just very concerned about the sensitivity of it, the language that one uses about these issues. How would I articulate that? How would I honestly capture Jon's work and the rest of the photographer's work? And you know, one of the questions that we pose in the curatorial statement is this question of, given the work that we all do, whether we're artists or curators or scholars or activists, how do we hold space between these two things of being honest about Black death and the loss of Black life, but also affirming Black life? Right? How do we hold these two spaces? And the ways in which that anxiety and those kinds of questions showed up for me was, you know, do I show an image of someone in a coffin in this project, or do I not? And so, Jon, you know, I'm curious if I hope that you feel that you can answer honestly in this space. I understand that what you're grappling with as an artist and as a Black man in America should be private too. But I'm curious, what were some of the struggles and the questions that you were asking yourself as you were navigating, beginning this project? And as the project evolved, and we'll end with what you did in Utah recently, but what were some of your own struggles and the questions that you were asking yourself about it?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm thinking of one, the community's already been through so much. I did not want there to be like any visible trauma on the bodies. So I wanted there to be some type of, you know, I wanted there to be grace. I wanted there to be, you know, some maybe elegance, for lack of a better word, but care with the bodies that are represented. You know, again, thinking of performance, thinking of, you know, the bodies either, you know, being cared for or held or draped or whatever it is. But I didn't want there to be, you know, visible trauma. I didn't want to, I'm missing the word, but not like but just like expanding on like the violence of these images or the grotesque, thinking of like, you know, the importance of, you know, Emmett Till's body, of his face being in that Jet magazine. I didn't want it to be that because, again, the community has already endured so much. I'm trying to look at this issue from another angle, but not, you know, send them over the edge, because I don't know what, you know, then how does it serve if it's then, you know, almost like, you know, thinking of, and I don't remember her name, from the Whitney Biennial, Dina Schutz, with the painting of, you know, I didn't want it to be that where you were looking at, you know, something as important, but again, as grotesque or, you know, just as trauma inducing in the images.
Mm-hmm. And Qiana, I really loved your question that you posed to Jon about those that are not traditionally mothers, but that do mother, right?
Mm-hmm.
The aunties that are mothering, and you know, the Mrs. So-and-so down the street that are mothering. And if you don't mind, I'd like to bring your own positionality into it as a mother yourself, and you're mothering children in this United States of America. And just to get your response when you first encountered this body of work from Jon, what your perhaps immediate response was, that visceral response to it was, and if that response and that engagement with it has shifted over time.
Yeah, I mean, the response to a work always shifts over time as I kind of sit with the images. And these are really images that you can sit with because of Jon's just amazing form of composition within each of the images, his very particular choices, as we talked about, in terms of his positioning of the bodies and the subjects and the landscapes that he chooses. My initial reaction was, I think what most people think, is just they're gut wrenching, you know, especially for me. The really, really powerful ones are the ones of where there are little babies in the image. You know, there's one mother who's holding her baby in her hand. He's probably about a year old. And I just think of my own children in that way too. And that's what, you know, I immediately thought of my own children, and their own frailty and their own vulnerability. I am raising a Black son. He's almost 11, and we have had to now start having the talk with him. You know, and that was simply triggered by him putting on a black hoodie one day, and I was just like, oh God, you know, here we go. And so, you know, and knowing that I can't always be around him and can't always protect him. And yes, I was raised by a single mother in Crown Heights, and during a time when, you know, there was a lot of social issues going on and a lot of tension as well between communities. And you hear my children in the background, sorry. But, so I'm constantly thinking about mothering, and particularly in giving credit to women and people who may mother and children that they haven't birthed, because that is an important service that the world benefits from.
Jon, I'm really thankful. I'm a language person, so I'm really thankful for the text in your project and the writing around it, the exposition around it, and in your in the paragraph that usually goes along with this series, you start off with a question, and the first question is, who is next? And when I read that question, you know, the full set of questions, you're referring to Black men, but I also think of that question as mothers asking themselves that question too. Am I next? Am I the next mother to go through this? And I wonder if you've had a conversation with your mother about this series and what her perhaps response, or the mothers in your life, what her response has been to it.
Not as much as you think. I mean, obviously, my mom was, you know, one of the inspiring factors, you know, thinking of my relationship with her and, you know, thinking of those conversations that we'd had. But in the actual creation of the work, Mom was kind of like, I told her about the work and told her what I was doing, but she was kind of distant, where she didn't. And this is more from like a practical standpoint, as an independent artist growing up, where Mom wasn't really interested. She's like, why aren't you doing something else with your life instead of wasting all this time and money making art where you could see no benefit from it? But when she saw the work in Aperture Foundation in 2017, and she came to the show, she understood the magnitude of what it was that I was talking about and what it was that I was contending with and why it was so important to me. It took her to see it in that space, to like look at the words again, to really understand like, oh, this is, and it's been amazing because that has, strengthened our relationship over the past couple of years, having that newfound appreciation for the work. So really, didn't I guess talk about it too much while I was making it, but now she understands like that it's important and the larger context of it.
I don't mean any disrespect, but since we're both Caribbean, it sounds like a very Caribbean kind of.
And
yeah,
my Panamanian mother as well, does not understand the work that I do creatively, and I've unfortunately not had as many conversations as I would like to have with my mother about my work. But it is so important that there are artists of color from all walks of life and all backgrounds, particularly, the African diaspora, because, we really need to add to the cultural conversation. And I feel like one of the powerful sort of moves of the work that you've made, Jon, is that, you kind of add to that discussion that these lynching photographs and have contributed to the photographic history of the medium and to the archive. Not only do you add, but you kind of, I feel like you almost cover it up, and you almost kind of start to tell a new story that hopefully isn't as violent. And because you take that intentional step of not portraying, bodies that have been are physically, marred by violence, kind of in the same way that Michelangelo's sculpture doesn't, right? It portrays Jesus in his body's very clean. You don't see any punctures or anything. It's very much a revered body, and you take the same approach. I think there is a sort of an aspect of hope and of care and of valuing Black bodies in your work. That should be, that's how it ultimately should be read. And I hope that you are getting a lot of offers to make this work be collectible and held in institutions going forward, because I do think they need to be in archives.
Baby steps, it's getting there.
I have one final question for both of you before we leave, but I also wanted to share that we aren't getting questions per se from our live audience, but just lots of comments. And all good stuff for your work, Jon. Just a brilliant concept coming from Robert Ayala and Michael Cordero. Just wants to thank you for showcasing these narratives. So thank you, audience, for those lovely thoughts and comments. As I was listening to the both of you, I couldn't help but think about the ways and the moments in which Black motherhood has entered the public sphere. And if I can point to sort of, one historical moment and a very contemporary moment, and Qiana, I think, and you too, Jon, I think you both brought this up. It was Emmett Till's mother that made that brave decision in 1955, Miss Mamie Till Mobley, to have an open casket for her son. Incredibly painful decision, but a really brave decision to let America see the violence that had been done to her child. And it was an incredible moment that opened up the conversation, I think, about Black mothers leading that charge for both protest and mourning of the people that we've lost. And then most recently, as we have had this 9-minute video replayed in George Floyd's trial, we also hear that brief moment of him calling out for his mother. And so we don't see a mother, but we hear the presence of a mother in his story. And so Jon and Qiana, I'm wondering, how do you see this project, both its beginning and the way you've continued it and the way you're going to end it, Jon? How do you see it sort of engaging the ways in which Black motherhood has entered into the public sphere, or even countered the ways Black motherhood has entered into the public sphere?
Well, I think people see like the power of the Black mother and starting to maybe hear their voice. I know Lucy McBath, who has been, she's, oh my God, fact check. She's the mother of Jordan Davis, who was murdered in Jacksonville because his radio was too loud. She's taking a more active role in politics. Samaria Rice as well has been more vocal with, leading the movement after what happened to her son. So many of the other mothers have been at the forefront, which I'm, incredibly proud of them for doing, because, it's obviously not easy. And after such a traumatic event, it's, I mean, how, would you be up to, that's a large ask to then, use that to spearhead and lead others. So I think it's great that, there have been, at the forefront of that, and, just thinking of Black mothers on the whole, the strength that they've had. But that's always been the strength of mothers that we just have not been shining a light on in history. And that's why, the mothers are so important. And that's why the project chooses to focus on the mothers, because again, there are too many times when are forgotten, or that role is forgotten, or you think of it just in one regard, but then, it's easily swept away and forgotten. So just really thinking about always coming back to the mother. Again, we've been talking about this issue for forever, but I wasn't seeing people talking about it from a mother's perspective, which is why the project has gone in this route.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead, Grace.
No, I was gonna leave you with the response, or not.
Yeah, no, I think this issue of or this idea of the mother is kind of I hope it's not a trend. I hope that we are starting to really think about the contributions and really how this country was sort of built on the labor of Black mothers, and how much really they've carried in since the founding of America as we know it. And I do hope that that means that there's support systems that get put in place, whether it be sort of institutional support systems or emotional support systems. I think even in this COVID pandemic as well, we're seeing necessary, and how much, aside from raising children, how much we really do to keep the world going. So I do hope that by doing the work that Jon's series does of highlighting the pain and the anguish, that there is this moment where we can really be finally humanized, and considered really going forward.
Qiana and Jon, I want to thank you both so much for, excuse the sounds of New York, for just a really beautiful and thoughtful and important conversation, not only about this series, Stranger Fruit, but these ideas of how we hold protest and mourning in the same space. I want to thank our entire Caddy staff and team, Kat Lazo, our producer behind the scenes, Mikey Cordero, who is our designer for On Protest and Mourning and has done just a beautiful job in visualizing the project. I know they're watching. Thank you all so much. And the entire staff at Caddy who has been really so supportive to this project. Please join us next week. To our audience, April 15th, we'll be in conversation with Vanessa Charlotte and her images capturing St. Louis, Missouri. And Jon, Qiana, thank you so much. And good night, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Grace.
Thank you.